Imagine a group of outlaws confident in their latest heist, believing they've captured an easy target. But there's something they don't know. Hidden in the shadows is a loyal companion, one with a past as fierce as it is heroic. A retired war dog, trained to protect, ready to strike. What happens when these criminals realize they've underestimated this bond of loyalty and courage? Stick around, because this is a story of unexpected bravery, cunning tactics, and a battle they never saw coming. The story opens on a dusty, remote town in the American Southwest. The sun blazes down on a small cafe where Claire, a local veterinarian, sits sipping her iced tea. Beside her lies Rocky, her German shepherd, his sharp eyes scanning the quiet street. Unbeknownst to most, Rocky isn't just any dog. He's a retired war dog who served alongside Claire's late husband in Afghanistan. The bond between Claire and Rocky runs deep, forged in the fires of loss and resilience. Rocky had been passed on to Claire after her husband's passing, becoming her protector and closest companion. The townsfolk admire Rocky, unaware of the extent of his training and capabilities, but they often joke about his soldier stance and alert demeanor. As Claire finishes her tea, a group of outlaws, led by a notorious criminal named Boone, rolls into town. They're a rough-looking crew, hardened by a life of crime. Boone, with his weathered face and icy blue eyes, scans the cafe. His gang is searching for quick cash and supplies, but their plans quickly escalate when they spot Claire, a woman alone with seemingly no protection other than her dog. Boone leans against the cafe counter, striking up casual conversation with Claire. At first it seems innocent, but his tone turns predatory. Sensing danger, Rocky stands up, positioning himself between Claire and Boone. The gang laughs at the sight, mocking the overprotective mutt. Ignoring the warning signs, Boone and his men decide to take Claire hostage, believing they can use her for ransom. Despite Rocky's growling protests, Boone overpowers Claire, dragging her towards their truck. Rocky lunges to protect her, but one of the gang members strikes him with the butt of a rifle, leaving him stunned on the ground as the truck speeds away into the desert. As the dust settles and Rocky regains consciousness, his training kicks in. Injured but undeterred, he picks up Claire's scent. His sharp instincts tell him that Claire's life is in grave danger, and he knows he's her only hope. The truck barrels down a winding dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust that blurs the horizon. Inside, Claire sits between two gang members, her wrists bound, her mind racing. Boone, the gang leader, drives with an air of confidence, certain that this kidnapping will net them a hefty ransom. Claire's fear is palpable, but beneath it lies a simmering resolve. She glances out the window, marking the route and noting landmarks in case an opportunity to escape arises. She knows that survival will depend on her ability to stay calm and think strategically. Meanwhile, back in town, Rocky has shaken off the blow he received. His sharp ears twitch as he picks up the faint sound of the truck's engine, fading into the distance. He starts sniffing the ground, zeroing in on Claire's scent. Every muscle in his body is taut with determination. Rocky's military training kicks in. During his years of service, he was taught to track under any conditions, endure pain, and remain laser-focused on his mission. His nose leads him to the edge of town, where tire tracks veer off the main road and into the open desert. Without hesitation, he begins his pursuit, weaving through cacti and rough terrain with an agility that defies his age. Back in the truck, Boone's crew begins to let their guard down, assuming their plan is foolproof. One of the men, a wiry figure named Jed, mocks Claire, teasing her about Rocky's failed attempt to protect her. "That dog of yours, he's probably limping back to town with his tail between his legs," Jed sneers. Claire glares at him, her voice steady despite her fear. "You have no idea what he's capable of. You'll regret underestimating him." Her words elicit laughter from the gang, but Boone's sharp gaze flickers with unease. He knows better than to dismiss a trained animal, especially one with military experience. Still, his bravado keeps him from voicing his concerns. As the gang drives deeper into the desert, Rocky continues his relentless pursuit. The sun blazes overhead, but he doesn't falter. He recalls the scent of Claire's perfume, a faint floral note that stands out against the harsh desert air. It guides him like a beacon. As night falls, the gang sets up camp in a secluded canyon. They light a fire and secure Claire to a tree, posting a single lookout to guard her. The rest of the crew begins drinking and laughing, their overconfidence blinding them to the threat lurking in the darkness. Unbeknownst to them, Rocky has arrived. From the shadows, His sharp eyes assess the scene. He watches the lookout's patterns, noting his moments of distraction. Rocky's instincts tell him to wait, to bide his time until he can act decisively. Claire notices a glimmer of movement in the distance, the faint reflection of firelight in Rocky's eyes. Her heart leaps with hope, but she quickly masks her reaction, not wanting to alert the gang. As the hours drag on, the gang's guard continues to drop. They see Claire as nothing more than a helpless pawn in their scheme. But in the silence of the night, Rocky prepares to strike. The campfire crackles softly as the gang's laughter fades into quiet murmurs, the desert night wrapping them in an eerie stillness. Claire remains tied to the tree, her eyes darting between the men and the shadows just beyond the firelight. She knows Rocky is out there, waiting for the right moment. Her heart pounds as she silently wills him to act. Rocky crouches low, concealed by the sparse brush. His training has taught him patience, to wait for the perfect opening. His keen eyes lock onto the lone lookout, a man slouched against a rock with a cigarette dangling from his lips. The man's head droops lower with each passing minute, his awareness dulled by exhaustion. Suddenly, a low growl rumbles in Rocky's throat, a sound so faint it's barely audible over the crackle of the fire. To Claire, however, it's a signal. Her pulse quickens as she braces herself, knowing that chaos is imminent. Rocky moves like a shadow, silent and swift. Before the lookout can react, Rocky lunges, his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's arm. The lookout lets out a sharp cry, but the sound is quickly muffled as Rocky drags him into the darkness. The gang springs to their feet, grabbing flashlights and weapons as confusion spreads through their ranks. "What was that?" Boone barks, his eyes scanning the darkened perimeter. Jed, holding a flashlight, peers into the night. "Probably a coyote. Let's check it out." As the gang fans out, their flashlights slicing through the darkness, Claire spots her chance. She begins to work her wrists against the rough rope binding her to the tree, using the commotion as a distraction. Meanwhile, Rocky positions himself for the next strike. He circles back toward the camp, his sharp mind calculating the gang's movements. He spots Jed, who has wandered too far from the group, his flashlight beam shaking as his nerves get the better of him. With a low guttural growl, Rocky charges. He barrels into Jed, knocking him to the ground. Jed screams from his weapon clattering out of reach as Rocky snarls inches from his face. The gang hears the commotion and rushes toward the sound, but Rocky vanishes into the shadows before they arrive. "What's going on?" Boone roars, his frustration mounting. He pulls Jed to his feet, only to find the man trembling and incoherent. It's the dog," Jed stammers. "That thing is a demon." Boone's expression hardens. "It's just a dog," he snaps. "Get a grip." But deep down, Boone feels a pang of doubt. This is no ordinary dog, and he knows it. His suspicion grows as he recalls Claire's earlier warning. "You'll regret underestimating him." Back at the tree, Claire finally loosens the rope. She frees her wrists and slips out of the gang's line of sight, her movements quiet and deliberate. She doesn't run, she knows that would draw attention. Instead, she crawls toward the edge of the camp, her eyes searching for Rocky. Rocky spots her immediately. He pads toward her, his movements cautious but purposeful. When their eyes meet, Claire feels a surge of relief. She whispers his name, her voice trembling with emotion. "Rocky, you found me." The reunion is brief, as the sound of Boone's voice cuts through the night. "Spread out. Find her, and that mutt." Claire looks at Rocky, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We have to move. They'll kill us if they catch us." Rocky seems to understand. He takes the lead, guiding Claire away from the camp and into the rocky terrain beyond. The pair moves with a silent urgency, weaving through narrow canyons and scaling steep inclines. Claire marvels at Rocky's precision, his ability to navigate the treacherous terrain with ease. But their escape is short-lived. Boone and his men are relentless, their flashlights bouncing off the canyon walls as they close in. The sound of boots crunching on gravel grows louder, and Claire knows they're running out of time. As they reach a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop, Rocky stops abruptly. He turns to Claire, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Suddenly, he lets out a bark, a sound filled with urgency and purpose. Claire follows his gaze and spots a narrow crevice in the rock wall. Without hesitation, she squeezes into the crevice, her body pressed tightly against the cold stone. Rocky follows, his muscular frame fitting just enough to provide cover. They hold their breath as the gang's footsteps grow louder, the beams of their flashlights sweeping dangerously close. "Keep looking!" Boone shouts. They couldn't have gone far. Claire and Rocky remain perfectly still, their bodies tense as the gang passes mere feet from their hiding spot. The sound of footsteps gradually fades, and Claire exhales a shaky breath. She looks at Rocky, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved me." Again. Rocky nudges her hand with his nose, his warm eyes filled with a silent reassurance. As the first hint of dawn breaks over the horizon, Claire realizes their ordeal is far from over. The gang is still hunting them, and their desperation makes them more dangerous than ever. But with Rocky by her side, she feels a flicker of hope, a belief that they might just make it out alive. As the sun climbs higher, casting warm light over the rugged canyon, Claire and Rocky press onward, their pace quick but measured. Every step is deliberate as they navigate the uneven terrain. The gang is still searching for them, their shouts and footsteps echoing faintly in the distance. Despite the danger, Claire feels a growing sense of determination. She isn't just running, she's planning. Rocky suddenly stops, his ears swiveling like radar dishes. A low growl escapes his throat as he crouches, his body coiled like a spring. Claire immediately drops to a crouch, following his gaze. Her heart sinks when she spots the gang's leader, Boone, appearing over the ridge. His silhouette is imposing against the brightening sky, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Claire!" Boone's voice booms across the canyon. "You can run all you want, but you're only making this harder on yourself. Come out now and I might let you live." Claire clenches her fists, the taunting words sparking a mix of fear and anger. She glances at Rocky, who remains perfectly still, his amber eyes locked on the approaching threat. Claire knows Boone won't stop until he gets what he wants, but she's no longer the helpless victim he assumes her to be. "Okay, Rocky," she whispers, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Let's show him who he's really dealing with." Rocky doesn't need further instruction. He slips into the shadows, his lean frame blending seamlessly with the rugged landscape. Claire moves in the opposite direction, drawing Boone's attention away from her canine partner. She clutches a jagged rock in her hand, ready to use it if necessary. As Boone descends the ridge, the sound of his boots crunching on loose gravel grows louder. He pauses, scanning the area with narrowed eyes. His men trail behind him, their weapons at the ready. "Find her," Boone commands, his voice dripping with menace. "And if you see that dog, shoot it." Rocky hears the order, and it only fuels his resolve. He circles around Boone's group, moving with the stealth of a predator. His acute senses pick up every detail: the scent of sweat on the men, the metallic tang of their weapons, the subtle shifts in the wind. He knows exactly when to strike. Suddenly, a sharp yelp cuts through the air, followed by the sound of a scuffle. Claire's heart leaps as she realizes what's happening. Rocky has ambushed one of Boone's men. The commotion draws the others away from her hiding spot, giving her a brief window of opportunity. Seizing the moment, Claire scrambles up a nearby incline, using her hands to steady herself on the loose rocks. She reaches a vantage point that overlooks the canyon floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. From here, she can see Rocky's handiwork, a disarmed and disoriented gang member lying in the dirt, his weapon nowhere in sight. "Get him!" Boone shouts, his frustration boiling over. Two of his men charge toward Rocky, their rifles raised. But Rocky is already on the move, darting between the rocks with astonishing agility. He leads the men on a chaotic chase, their gunfire echoing uselessly against the canyon walls. From her perch, Claire spots an opportunity. One of the gang members has left his pack unattended near the base of the ridge. She carefully descends the slope, her movements precise and deliberate. When she reaches the pack, she rifles through it, her fingers closing around a small flare gun. "Perfect," she murmurs, a plan forming in her mind. With the flare gun in hand, Claire climbs back to her vantage point. She aims it skyward, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She pulls the trigger, and a brilliant streak of red light arcs into the sky, its fiery trail visible for miles. The sound of the flare startles Boone and his men. They whip around, their focus momentarily diverted. Rocky uses the distraction to his advantage, taking down another gang member with a calculated leap. The man cries out as he tumbles to the ground, his weapon clattering out of reach. "Enough of this!" Boone roars, his patience finally snapping. He raises his rifle, aiming directly at Rocky. Claire's heart stops. "No!" she screams, her voice raw with desperation. But before Boone can pull the trigger, Rocky pivots sharply, launching himself at the gang leader with unrelenting force. The impact sends Boone sprawling, his rifle skidding across the ground. Rocky stands over him, his teeth bared and a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Boone freezes, his bravado crumbling in the face of Rocky's fury. All right, he stammers, his hands raised in surrender. Call off your dog. Claire emerges from her hiding spot, the flare gun still in her hand. She locks eyes with Boone, her expression fierce and unyielding. You thought I was weak, she says, her voice steady. But you underestimated me, and you underestimated him. As the flare's smoke dissipates in the sky, a distant sound reaches their ears, the unmistakable whir of a helicopter. Claire's signal has been seen, and help is on the way. The whirring sound of the approaching helicopter grows louder, cutting through the canyon's silence. Boone's gang members, now scattered and disoriented, exchange nervous glances. They hadn't anticipated a turn of events like this, and their confidence wavers as the realization dawns that they are no longer in control. Claire keeps her eyes fixed on Boone, her grip tightening on the flare gun. Rocky stands over him, his growl low but menacing, teeth bared in warning. Boone's bravado is gone, replaced by a mix of fear and anger as he stares at the snarling dog. Call him off, Boone says, his voice trembling slightly. This isn't over, lady. You think a helicopter changes anything? You're just delaying the inevitable. Claire steps forward, her expression resolute. You had every chance to walk away from this, but you chose violence. Now you're going to face the consequences. Rocky's growl intensifies as Boone shifts slightly, testing the boundaries of his captor. Easy, Rocky, Claire murmurs, her voice calm but commanding. The dog doesn't break his stance, but lowers the volume of his growl, a clear signal that he's in control. Meanwhile, the rest of the gang scrambles to regroup, their cohesion crumbling under the mounting pressure. One of the men, visibly panicked, shouts, "We need to get out of here. That chopper's going to bring the law." "No one's running," another replies, though his tone lacks conviction. "We stick to the plan. Boone will handle this." Claire watches their interactions closely, noting the cracks forming in their unity. She knows the helicopter will arrive soon, but they aren't out of danger yet. Boone's gang is still armed, and desperation can make them unpredictable. The helicopter emerges over the ridge, its sleek black frame shimmering in the sunlight. The sound is deafening as it hovers above the canyon, its downdraft kicking up dust and debris. Claire raises her arm, waving to signal their location. Inside the helicopter, the pilot nods in acknowledgement, while a second figure, a park ranger armed and ready, prepares to disembark. The sight of the helicopter sends Boone's men into a frenzy. One of them fires a warning shot into the air, a futile gesture meant to intimidate. The ranger responds instantly, using the helicopter's PA system to issue a stern warning. "Drop your weapons and stay where you are. Assistance is on the way, and the area is surrounded. Surrender now, and no one gets hurt." The authority in his voice rattles the gang further. Two of them throw down their rifles, their faces pale with fear. Another hesitates, glancing at Boone for direction, but the gang leader remains silent, his mind racing for a way out. "Do you hear that, Boone?" Claire says, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Your time is up. You can either cooperate or make this worse for yourself and everyone around you." Boone glares at her, his jaw tightening. "You think you've won. You don't know who you're dealing with." Claire steps closer, her gaze unwavering. "You're right, I don't, but I know this. You underestimated me, and you underestimated him." She gestures toward Rocky, who remains vigilant, his eyes locked on Boone. As the helicopter lands nearby, the ranger steps out, his weapon trained on the gang. "Everyone down on the ground now," he orders, his tone leaving no room for argument. One by one, the gang members comply, dropping to their knees with their hands behind their heads. Boone resists for a moment, his pride keeping him upright, but a sharp bark from Rocky breaks his resolve. He drops to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. Once the gang is secured, the ranger approaches Claire, his face a mix of relief and admiration. "You did the right thing signaling us," he says. "We've been tracking this gang for months, but we never had enough to bring them down. Thanks to you, that changes today." Claire nods, her adrenaline finally ebbing. "They kidnapped me. They thought I was an easy target." She glances at Rocky, her voice softening. "But they didn't know about him." The ranger looks at Rocky with newfound respect. "He's a remarkable dog. Looks like he's been through his share of battles." Claire smiles faintly. "He's saved lives before. Today he saved mine. As the ranger questions Boone and his gang, another ranger examines the van the outlaws used during the kidnapping. Inside, they find a trove of stolen goods, jewelry, electronics, and even documents suggesting involvement in a larger crime ring. The discovery deepens the severity of their crimes, solidifying their fate. Boone remains defiant, but the weight of the evidence against him is undeniable. He glares at Claire one last time as he's led away in handcuffs. "You'll regret this," he mutters. "This isn't over." Claire meets his gaze without flinching. "Yes, it is." With the immediate danger neutralized, Claire takes a moment to breathe. She kneels beside Rocky, running her fingers through his fur. "We did it, buddy," she says, her voice filled with gratitude. "We're safe." The dog leans into her touch, his loyalty unwavering. For the first time in hours, Claire feels a sense of peace. As the dust settles and the gang is taken into custody, Claire finally allows herself a moment to exhale. The adrenaline coursing through her veins subsides, replaced by the heavy weight of everything that has just transpired. She watches as the rangers escort Boone and his men toward waiting vehicles, their faces sullen with defeat. But as the gang disappears from view, a nagging feeling lingers in the back of her mind. Something about Boone's last words doesn't sit right. "You'll regret this," Boone had muttered as he was led away. His tone was laced with a quiet menace, a promise rather than a threat. Claire shakes her head, trying to dismiss it, but the memory clings stubbornly. She looks down at Rocky, who seems equally uneasy, his ears twitching at every sound. The dog senses it too. This isn't over. The ranger who had taken the lead earlier approaches Claire, clipboard in hand. "Miss Sanders," he says, his tone professional yet empathetic, "we'll need you to come by the station tomorrow to finalize your statement, but for now you should focus on getting some rest." Claire nods, though the idea of rest feels foreign. "Thank you, I'll be there." As the ranger turns to leave, another approaches, holding a small device. "We found this on one of the gang members," he says, handing the GPS tracker to his colleague. "Looks like they were coordinating with someone else. The coordinates lead to a location about 50 miles north of here." Claire's heart sinks. "What does that mean?" she asks, her voice edged with concern. The lead ranger frowns, studying the device. "It could mean Boone and his gang aren't working alone. If that's the case, there may be more to this operation than we realized." As they speak, Rocky suddenly perks up, his ears standing erect and his nose twitching. He lets out a low growl, his gaze fixed on a nearby ridge. Claire follows his line of sight, but sees nothing out of the ordinary, just the jagged rocks and sparse vegetation of the canyon. Still, Rocky's reaction puts her on edge. She knows better than to ignore his instincts. "What is it, boy?" she asks, crouching beside him. Rocky sniffs the air again, his tail stiff and his body tense. Whatever he senses, it's enough to unsettle him. The ranger notices the interaction and steps closer. "Is he trained for this kind of situation?" he asks. Claire nods. "Rocky's a retired war dog. He's trained to detect danger before it happens." The ranger's expression hardens. "Then we'd better take his warning seriously. Let's get you out of here and somewhere safe." The rangers arrange for Claire and Rocky to be transported to a secure location until they can determine the extent of the gang's operation. Though reluctant to leave, Claire agrees, knowing it's the safest option for now. As they drive through the winding roads leading away from the canyon, Rocky remains alert, his eyes scanning the horizon and his body coiled like a spring. In the back of the vehicle, Claire sits quietly, her mind racing. She can't shake the feeling that Boone's gang is only the tip of the iceberg. What were they really after? Was her kidnapping part of a larger plan, or was it simply a crime of opportunity? The ranger driving the vehicle glances at her through the rearview mirror. "You're lucky to have that dog," he says, breaking the silence. "Not many people can say their best friend is also their protector." Claire manages a small smile. "He's more than that. Rocky's been through things most people can't even imagine. He's saved lives, including mine." The ranger nods, his respect evident. "Well, let's hope he's wrong this time and there's no more trouble coming." The secure location turns out to be a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. It's equipped with basic amenities and a satellite phone for emergencies. Claire steps out of the vehicle, taking in her surroundings. The dense forest and the faint chirping of birds create a stark contrast to the chaos she left behind. "This is where you'll stay for now," the ranger explains. "We'll have someone checking in on you regularly, and there's a patrol that sweeps the area every few hours." Claire thanks him. though the idea of isolation makes her uneasy. As the Rangers drive away, leaving her and Rocky alone, the weight of the situation settles heavily on her shoulders. She locks the door behind her and kneels beside Rocky, who seems to share her apprehension. "We'll be okay, boy," she says, stroking his fur. "We've been through worse." But even as she says the words, a chill runs down her spine. Something about the silence feels unnatural, as though the forest itself is holding its breath. That night, as Claire lies in bed, she's jolted awake by Rocky's growl. She sits up, her heart pounding, and listens intently. The cabin is silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves outside. Rocky stands at the window, his body rigid and his gaze locked on the tree line. "Is someone out there?" Claire whispers, grabbing the flashlight from the bedside table. She shines the beam outside, but the dense underbrush reveals nothing. Still, Rocky doesn't relax, his growl persisting as he paces back and forth. Claire's pulse quickens. She knows Rocky's instincts are rarely wrong. "Stay here," she tells him, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. She grabs the satellite phone and dials the ranger station, her eyes never leaving the window. "This is Claire Sanders," she says when the call connects. "I think someone's outside the cabin." The ranger on the other end doesn't hesitate. "Stay inside and keep all the doors locked. We're sending a patrol your way now." Claire hangs up and takes a deep breath. Whatever is happening, she knows one thing for sure: this isn't over. Inside the dimly lit cabin, Claire paces the floor, her heart racing as she tries to calm her nerves. Rocky sits by the door, his ears perked and his body coiled like a spring, ready to act. The weight of the situation presses down on her. She's no stranger to danger, but the sense of isolation amplifies every sound, every shadow. Claire checks the satellite phone again, ensuring the line is open and ready in case the Rangers call back. The minutes tick by in agonizing silence. She kneels beside Rocky, her hands trembling as she strokes his fur. "Do you think I made a mistake, boy?" she whispers. "Maybe I should have pushed harder for answers back at the canyon. Maybe—" Rocky's low growl interrupts her thoughts, snapping her back to the present. His body stiffens, and his eyes lock onto the window. Claire follows his gaze, her breath catching as she sees faint movement in the shadows outside. Her grip tightens on the flashlight. "Who's out there?" she calls, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. No response. The forest remains eerily still, but Rocky's growl deepens. Claire grabs the rifle the Rangers had left behind, a precaution she hadn't expected to need so soon. A shadowy figure steps into the moonlight, their hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Claire's finger hovers over the trigger as she shines the flashlight on them. The light reveals a man in his mid-40s, his face weathered and his clothes torn. "Please, don't shoot," the man calls out, his voice shaky. "I'm not here to hurt you." Claire hesitates, the weight of the rifle growing heavier in her hands. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man takes a cautious step forward. "My name's Mark. I was part of Boone's crew, but I wasn't there by choice. I ran when I saw the Rangers coming. Please, you have to believe me." Rocky growls again, inching closer to the door. Claire's instincts scream at her to stay cautious. "Why should I trust you?" she demands. Mark lowers his hands slightly, his eyes filled with desperation. "Because I know something you don't, something about Boone's plan. They were after more than just you. There's a bigger operation at play." Claire's mind races. Letting Mark in could be a trap, but if he's telling the truth, his information could be crucial. She looks down at Rocky, who stares intently at the man outside. Trusting her dog's instincts, she makes a decision. "Stay where you are," she says, unlocking the door but keeping it chained. "If you try anything, this door closes, and the Rangers will deal with you." Mark nods, his body visibly trembling. "Fair enough, just listen to what I have to say." Claire keeps the rifle in her hands as she listens. "Start talking." Mark takes a deep breath, his eyes darting nervously between Claire and the tree line. "Boone's gang wasn't just out to make a quick buck. They're part of a network trafficking weapons and people. When they grabbed you, it wasn't random. They had orders to intercept you specifically." Claire's stomach churns. "Me? Why?" "You were seen with the Rangers," Mark explains. "They assumed you were working with them to investigate their routes. Boone wanted leverage, someone the Rangers wouldn't risk leaving behind." Claire clenches her jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "And you just went along with it?" Mark flinches at her tone. "I didn't have a choice. They threatened my family. I was just the driver, I swear. When I saw how far Boone was willing to go, I couldn't be a part of it anymore. Rocky inches closer to the door, his growl softening, but his body still tense. Claire narrows her eyes at Mark. If what you're saying is true, why come here? Why not go to the Rangers directly? Mark hesitates, his face etched with guilt. Because Boone isn't done. He had a backup plan in case the first one failed. They're regrouping at a hideout nearby and they've got reinforcements coming. Claire's grip on the rifle tightens. Why are you telling me this? Mark looks her in the eye, his desperation giving way to sincerity. Because I don't want anyone else to get hurt. If you tell the Rangers where they're hiding, maybe they can stop this before it gets worse. Claire steps back, her mind swirling with questions. She doesn't trust Mark completely, but his story fits with what she already knows. Still, letting him leave could mean losing a valuable source of information, or worse, putting herself in further danger if he's lying. I'll call the Rangers, she says finally, but you're staying here until they arrive. Mark nods, his relief palpable. Fair enough. As Claire locks the door again, she glances at Rocky. His posture has relaxed slightly, but his eyes remain vigilant. Claire knows she's walking a fine line, balancing trust and caution in a situation where one wrong move could cost her everything. The cabin was silent except for the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Claire kept her eyes on Mark, who sat on a worn chair near the door. Rocky lay at her feet, his eyes never leaving the stranger, his occasional growls a reminder of the precarious trust in the room. The satellite phone buzzed, its shrill tone breaking the tension. Claire quickly answered, keeping her rifle within reach. On the other end was Officer Garrett, the ranger she had spoken to earlier. Claire, we're en route to your location, Garrett said. We've intercepted some chatter that aligns with what you told us. Boone's group is regrouping at an old logging site about 10 miles from you. Reinforcements are on their way. Claire glanced at Mark, her grip on the phone tightening. I've got someone here. Mark. He claims to be one of Boone's men, but he says he's trying to help. He told me about the hideout. There was a pause on the line. Claire, be cautious. Boone's crew is known for manipulation. If this Mark is genuine, he could be a key witness. But if he's lying, you know the stakes. I do, Claire replied, her voice firm. I'll handle it. After hanging up, Claire turned to Mark. The Rangers are coming. If there's anything else you're hiding, now's the time to come clean. Mark hesitated, his gaze darting to the floor. There's one more thing. Boone, he has a list. Names of people in the area who've been helping the Rangers, locals providing intel. If he gets to them before the Rangers do, Claire felt a chill run down her spine. You're telling me this now? Do you know who's on that list? Mark shook his head. I didn't see the names, but I overheard Boone talking. One of them is supposed to live near this cabin. Her breath caught. Could she be on that list? Or worse, one of her neighbors. The thought of Boone's crew targeting innocent people ignited a spark of determination within her. Before Claire could question Mark further, Rocky sprang to his feet, his growl low and menacing. He moved to the window, his ears perked as his nose twitched. Claire grabbed the rifle and crept to the window, peering into the darkness. The faint glow of flashlights bobbed through the trees, accompanied by the murmur of voices. She counted at least 3 figures moving cautiously toward the cabin. They're here, she whispered, her stomach knotting. Boone's men. Mark's face paled. If they find me here, they'll kill us all. Boone doesn't tolerate traitors. Claire motioned for him to stay quiet and turned to Rocky. Stay ready, boy, she murmured. The dog's eyes gleamed with understanding as he positioned himself near the door, his body tense. The men outside moved closer, their voices becoming clearer. Claire could hear snippets of their conversation. Boone said to check this area, one said, his tone gruff. If she's here, we grab her. No mistakes this time, another voice responded. What about the Ranger team? They'll be here soon? Doesn't matter, the first man replied. Boone wants her alive, and if the dog gets in the way... Claire didn't let him finish. She stepped back from the window, her mind racing. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation. They were outnumbered, and any gunfire would draw more attention, but she wasn't about to let them take her or Rocky. Mark, she whispered, her voice urgent. Do you know the trails around here? Mark nodded, his face still pale. I've used them to get to Boone's hideout. There's a narrow path behind the cabin that leads to higher ground. It's steep, but it'll buy us time. Claire considered her options. Staying in the cabin was too risky. If Boone's men got inside, it would be a death trap. The trail was their best chance, but it would mean abandoning the relative safety of the cabin. "Fine," she said, her decision made. "We'll take the trail. But if you so much as try to lead us into a trap—" "I won't," Mark said quickly. "I swear." Claire grabbed the essentials, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and her rifle. She opened the back door silently, gesturing for Rocky to stay close. Mark followed, his movements careful as they slipped into the night. The trail was as treacherous as Mark had warned. Rocks shifted under their feet, and the dense underbrush slowed their progress. Claire kept her flashlight low, avoiding detection from the flashlight sweeping the cabin behind them. Rocky led the way, his instincts guiding them. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made Claire's heart race, but the dog remained calm and focused, giving her a sliver of reassurance. Halfway up the trail, voices echoed through the trees. Boone's men had discovered the empty cabin and were spreading out to search the area. Claire motioned for everyone to stop, her heart pounding as the beam of a flashlight passed dangerously close. Rocky crouched low, his ears flat against his head. Mark's breathing was shallow, and Claire could feel the tension radiating from him. The voices grew louder, the men seemingly unaware of how close they were. Claire gripped the rifle tightly, ready to defend herself if necessary. But before the men could spot them, a distant howl pierced the night, perhaps a coyote or wolf. The distraction was enough to draw them away, and Claire silently thanked the forest for its unexpected ally. After what felt like an eternity, the trio reached the higher ground Mark had mentioned. From their vantage point, they could see the cabin below, now surrounded by Boone's men. Flashlights moved erratically as the search continued. Claire exhaled deeply, her adrenaline beginning to subside. "We're safe for now," she said, though the words felt hollow. She knew this was only the beginning. High above the cabin on the rocky plateau, the night air was cold, and the faint hum of Boone's men searching below sent shivers down Claire's spine. She leaned against a large boulder, catching her breath, as Mark slumped nearby, visibly shaken. Rocky, ever vigilant, paced in a tight circle, his ears attuned to every rustle and whisper in the forest. Claire glanced at Mark, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but his knowledge of Boone's operations had already proven useful. "What's Boone's next move?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Mark hesitated, rubbing his hands together nervously. "If they don't find you, they'll head to the hideout to regroup and figure out their next steps. Boone's not the type to give up." Claire's jaw tightened. "And the people on that list, are they in immediate danger?" Mark nodded solemnly. "If Boone thinks they've been compromised, he won't hesitate to retaliate. He thrives on fear and control." The gravity of the situation hit Claire like a punch to the gut. She couldn't just focus on her own safety. There were others who might be in peril because of Boone's vendetta. As Claire processed Mark's words, Rocky trotted over to her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. She crouched beside him, her hand brushing through his thick fur. His calm demeanor reminded her of their shared history, of battles fought and survived together. "Good boy," she whispered. "We'll get through this." Mark watched the interaction, a flicker of something akin to admiration crossing his face. "He's incredible," he said, his voice soft. "You can tell he'd give his life for you." Claire straightened, meeting his gaze. "He's saved me more times than I can count. I owe him everything." Mark hesitated before asking, "What's his story? How does a war dog end up in the middle of nowhere with someone like you?" Claire debated whether to share, but something in Mark's tone made her relent. "Rocky served with me overseas. I was his handler. When I retired, I couldn't leave him behind. We've been a team ever since." Mark nodded slowly. "He's lucky to have you." Claire gave a faint smile. "I think it's the other way around." The distant sound of an engine rumbling through the forest jolted them back to the present. Claire crouched low, signaling for Rocky to stay quiet. Through the dense trees, she spotted headlights in the distance, bouncing along the uneven terrain. Mark's face paled. "That's Boone," he whispered. "I recognize the truck." Claire's pulse quickened. "He's here. I thought you said he'd stay at the hideout." Mark shook his head. "If he's coming himself, it means he's getting desperate." They watched as the truck came to a halt near the cabin. Boone stepped out, his tall frame silhouetted against the headlights. He barked orders to his men, his voice carrying through the night. "Spread out! She's close, I can feel it. And find that traitor Mark, he won't get far." Mark shrank back, his fear palpable. Claire's mind raced. They couldn't stay on the plateau indefinitely. Boone's men would eventually find the trail leading up. She needed a plan, and fast. An idea began to form as Claire scanned the terrain. The plateau offered a natural bottleneck, a place where they could control the flow of attackers. She turned to Mark. "Do Boone's men have radios?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, they all carry them to stay in touch." Claire's eyes lit with determination. "Then we're going to send them a message they won't forget." Mark frowned. "What are you thinking?" She glanced at Rocky, a plan solidifying in her mind. "We're going to make them think they've walked into a trap. If we can spook them enough, they'll back off, at least long enough for the Rangers to get here." Mark hesitated, but the resolve in Claire's eyes was unshakable. "What do you need me to do?" Claire instructed Mark to gather rocks and branches to create decoys that could resemble additional people hiding on the plateau. Meanwhile, she used her flashlight to signal Rocky, who seemed to understand her intentions immediately. "Stay low," she whispered to Mark as they finished setting up. "When Boone's men get close, that will make it seem like they're surrounded." Mark nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped a large branch. "What about Boone?" Claire's expression hardened. "I'll handle him." As Boone's men approached the trail, Claire and Rocky moved into position. Using a whistle she had kept from her military days, she signaled a series of sharp commands. Rocky darted into the shadows, barking loudly to create the illusion of multiple dogs. The echoes of his movements and the rustling of decoys added to the chaos. Boone's men hesitated, their flashlights darting wildly. "Did you hear that?" one muttered. Another replied, "It sounds like there's a whole pack of them." Claire's voice rang out from the shadows, calm and authoritative. "You're surrounded. Drop your weapons and back off." The men froze, exchanging uncertain glances. Boone, standing further back, shouted, "Don't listen to her, she's bluffing." But the combination of Rocky's strategic movements and the makeshift decoys began to shake their confidence. One man stepped back, his hand trembling as he lowered his flashlight. What if she's not bluffing? The distraction worked. Boone's men began retreating toward the truck, their nerves fraying under the pressure. Boone, however, stood his ground, his eyes scanning the darkness with cold determination. "You can't hide forever," he bellowed. "When I find you, you'll wish you never crossed me." Claire watched from her hiding spot, her grip on the rifle steady. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, they had bought themselves precious time. As the echoes of Boone's threats faded into the night, Claire crouched behind a boulder, her mind racing. She knew they couldn't hold out forever. The deception had worked for now, but Boone wasn't the type to walk away without a fight. Her heart pounded as she calculated their next move. Down below, Boone barked orders at his remaining men, his frustration boiling over. "Get back here, all of you!" he shouted, his voice laced with venom. "She's one woman and a dog. We're not losing this battle." Reluctantly, the men regrouped by the truck, casting uneasy glances over their shoulders. Boone paced like a caged predator, his eyes scanning the darkened trail leading up to the plateau. "This ends tonight," he growled. "No more games." From her vantage point, Claire could see the determination etched into Boone's face. He wasn't going to retreat, he was going to escalate. Her mind churned with possibilities. They needed an edge, something that could shift the balance in their favor. Mark, still crouched beside her, whispered, "We can't take them all." "What's the plan?" Claire's jaw tightened. "We don't need to take them all. We just need to keep them off balance long enough for help to arrive." She glanced at Rocky, who stood alert at her side. His ears twitched, picking up on every sound. Claire reached into her backpack and retrieved a small signal flare, her last resort. If Boone's men got too close, the flare would serve as a distraction and a call for help. Just as she was about to explain her plan, Rocky stiffened, his eyes locked on a shadow moving near the edge of the plateau. Claire followed his gaze and spotted a figure slowly climbing the trail. At first, her breath caught in her throat, fearing it was one of Boone's men. But as the figure stepped into the faint moonlight, she recognized the khaki uniform and hat of a park ranger. Relief flooded through her. She motioned for the ranger to approach quietly. As he reached them, he crouched down and whispered, "I'm Ranger Stevens. We got your message. Backup is on the way, but it's going to take time. What's the situation?" Claire quickly briefed him, pointing toward the group gathered around Boone's truck. Stevens nodded, his face grim. "We need to hold them here until the others arrive. Do you have a way to keep them from advancing?" Claire held up the flare. "This might buy us some time." Below, Boone rallied his men, arming them with flashlights, bats, and the occasional hunting rifle. "We're going up there," he snarled. And we're not coming back down until we have her. As the group began ascending the trail, their footsteps crunching against the rocky terrain, Claire turned to Stevens. If we can slow them down, we might be able to funnel them into a choke point. Stevens nodded, his eyes scanning the terrain. There's a narrow pass about 50 feet down the trail. We can use that to our advantage. Claire, Stevens, Marks, and Rocky moved quickly to the choke point. Using rocks and fallen branches, they created a makeshift barrier that would force Boone's men to move single file. Rocky took position at the front, his low growls echoing through the night. The sound of Boone's men grew louder, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Claire raised the flare, ready to ignite it at a moment's notice. "They're coming," Stevens muttered, gripping his radio. "Back up, better hurry." As the first of Boone's men reached the narrow pass, Rocky barked ferociously, his sharp teeth bared. The man froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What the? There's a dog!" he shouted. "Keep moving!" Boone barked from behind, shoving the man forward. "It's just a dog!" The man hesitated but pressed on, stepping over the makeshift barrier. Rocky lunged, snapping at his heels, and the man stumbled back with a yelp. "Get that mutt!" Boone roared. Claire seized the moment, igniting the flare and hurling it toward Boone's group. The bright red light exploded in the darkness, illuminating the forest and startling the attackers. "It's a trap!" one of the men shouted, dropping his weapon and scrambling back down the trail. The flare's sudden burst of light and Rocky's relentless presence sent a wave of panic through Boone's group. Several men retreated, their confidence shattered. Boone, however, remained defiant. "Cowards!" he yelled. "She's bluffing. It's just one woman." But as he pushed forward, he came face to face with Claire, her rifle trained on him. Behind her, Stevens and Mark stood ready, their determination evident. "It's over, Boone," Claire said, her voice steady. "Your men are gone, and the authorities are on their way. You can either walk away or make this worse for yourself." Boone's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. Before he could respond, the distant sound of sirens pierced the night air. He glanced back at the trail, realizing his time was up. As the sirens grew louder, Boone's remaining men abandoned their positions, retreating toward the truck. Boone stood frozen, torn between fight and flight. Rocky took a step forward, his growl low and menacing. Boone's eyes darted to the dog, then to Claire. With a resigned sigh, he dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Claire kept her rifle trained on him as Stevens moved in to cuff him. "You made the right choice," she said, her voice cold. Boone glared at her. "This isn't over," he muttered. "You'll regret crossing me." Claire didn't respond, her focus shifting to the sound of approaching vehicles. The cavalry had arrived. As the flashing lights of police vehicles cast blue and red patterns across the forest, Claire finally exhaled the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Boone stood cuffed and defiant, his eyes scanning the arriving officers as if searching for a way out. His presence was imposing even in defeat, a reminder that the danger wasn't entirely gone. Ranger Stevens stepped forward, his authoritative voice cutting through the tense air. "Boone Caldwell, you're under arrest for kidnapping, attempted assault, and trespassing on protected land. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Boone sneered, but said nothing. His silence was unnerving, a quiet defiance that made Claire's skin crawl. As officers moved to secure Boone's men, Claire turned her attention to the few who hadn't fled. They sat huddled near the truck, hands in the air and faces pale under the harsh beam of police flashlights. One officer approached Claire, his notebook open. "You're Claire Matthews, right? We'll need a full statement from you about what happened here." Claire nodded, her exhaustion evident. "Of course, but first, we need to ensure those people don't come back here. They know the terrain, and if they slip away..." The officer held up a hand. "We've got them under control. We've been tracking Boone's group for months. Your tip gave us the break we needed." As the officers worked, Rocky stood guard at Claire's side, his eyes never leaving Boone. The dog's posture was tense, his instincts still on high alert. Boone noticed, his lips curling into a taunting smile. "What's the matter, dog?" Boone sneered. "Afraid I'll come back." Rocky let out a deep, rumbling growl, his teeth bared in silent warning. Claire placed a reassuring hand on his head, her voice calm but firm. "Ignore him, boy. He's not worth it." Boone's grin faltered as Rocky held his ground, the dog's unwavering gaze unnerving even the hardened outlaw. Mark Quorn, who had remained quiet during the initial chaos, stepped closer to Claire. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "You know, I always thought you were tough, Claire, but tonight You've proven you're more than that. You're fearless." Claire glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "I'm not fearless, Mark. I was terrified. But when it comes to protecting what matters, fear doesn't get to win." Her words hung in the air, resonating with a weight that silenced even Mark's usual bravado. He looked at Rocky, then back at Claire. "That dog of yours is something else. You trained him well." "Rocky trained me," Claire replied with a faint smile. "He taught me how to trust, how to fight back when it matters." As Boone was being led toward one of the police vehicles, he turned his head to glare at Claire. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "You think this is over. It's not. People like me don't stay locked up for long." Claire didn't flinch. She met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "And people like me don't forget. Next time, Boone, you won't get the chance to run." The officer escorting Boone gave him a shove. "Move it," he barked, ending the exchange. Boone stumbled slightly but recovered. His jaw clenched as he was forced into the back seat. With Boone and his men secured, the scene began to settle. Officers swept the area, collecting evidence and documenting the damage caused by the outlaws. Claire leaned against a tree, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of the night. Ranger Stevens approached, his expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "You did good tonight, Claire. Without you, this could have ended very differently." "Rocky deserves the credit," Claire said, her hand resting on the dog's head. "He's the one who kept us safe." Stevens nodded. "Even so, it takes someone strong to lead a dog like him. You've both earned a lot of respect tonight." Before he could say more, an officer called Stevens over to review some evidence. As he walked away, Claire knelt beside Rocky. The dog's ears perked up as she whispered to him, "We're almost done, boy. Just a little longer and we can go home." Rocky licked her hand in response, his loyalty unwavering. Mark, who had been lingering nearby, finally spoke. "Claire, I know this might not be the right time, but why didn't you tell me about Rocky's past?" "That he's a retired war dog." Claire hesitated, her eyes studying Mark's face. "It wasn't about keeping secrets. It was about protecting him. Rocky's been through enough. I didn't want people seeing him as a weapon or a tool. He deserves better than that." Mark nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. He does. And so do you." As the night wore on, the police began packing up their equipment, the flashing lights dimming one by one. The forest fell into an uneasy silence, the echoes of the confrontation still lingering. Claire took a deep breath, her hand tightening on Rocky's leash. She knew the night wasn't over yet. There were still questions to answer, decisions to make, and a story to tell. But for now, they had survived, and that was enough. The forest, though quiet now, seemed to hum with the weight of what had transpired. The officers finished gathering evidence, and Boone's men were escorted to waiting vehicles, their heads hanging low. Despite the initial sense of relief, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't fully won. Ranger Stevens approached Claire, his brow furrowed. "We've got Boone and his crew, but something's not adding up. He's been involved in smuggling operations for years. Rare animals, artifacts, even weapons. Tonight's stunt doesn't fit his usual patterns." Claire frowned, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Boone might not have been here just for you. There's a bigger picture we're missing, and he knows it," Stevens said grimly, glancing toward the police car where Boone sat. His face shadowed, but his smirk still visible. Rocky let out a low growl, his body tense. Claire followed his gaze to see Boone staring at her, his expression unnervingly calm. Unable to ignore her instincts, Claire approached the vehicle. Two officers stood guard, but allowed her a moment to speak. She crouched slightly, meeting Boone's eyes through the partially open window. "What's your game, Boone? Why target me and my dog?" she asked, her voice steady despite her simmering anger. Boone chuckled, leaning back against the seat. "You think this is about you, sweetheart? You're just a pawn. That dog of yours, though, he's the prize." Claire's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? Rocky's got a reputation, even outside the military," Boone continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "You don't think people notice when a war dog like him disappears off the radar? Some very interested parties would pay a fortune to get their hands on him." Her grip on Rocky's leash tightened. "You're lying. No one's coming for him." Boone's smile widened. "Believe what you want. But if I were you, I'd sleep with one eye open. This ain't over." The officer stepped in, cutting off Boone's taunts as he slammed the door shut. Claire stood frozen, her mind racing. Was Rocky truly safe, Or had Boone's words planted a seed of doubt she couldn't ignore? As the officers prepared to leave, one of Boone's men broke free from his restraints, sprinting toward the woods. Chaos erupted as the officers scrambled to react, shouting orders and drawing their weapons. Without hesitation, Rocky launched into action. His powerful frame surged forward, his training kicking in instinctively. Claire shouted his name, but it was clear he knew exactly what he was doing. In a blur of motion, Rocky tackled the fleeing man, pinning him to the ground with surprising precision. The officers moved in quickly, securing the suspect and offering a stunned nod of respect to the dog. "He's more than just a pet," one officer murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. Claire knelt beside Rocky, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're incredible." The escape attempt heightened everyone's nerves, and it became clear that Boone's influence over his men was stronger than anticipated. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Boone's operation ran deeper than they'd uncovered tonight. Stevens approached her again, his tone grave. "We're going to dig into Boone's network. If what he said about Rocky is true, there might be others interested in him. You'll need to be careful." Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll be ready." As the scene began to clear, Mark approached Claire, his expression unusually serious. "Claire, I owe you an apology," he began, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "For what?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "For doubting you. I didn't think you needed Rocky, not really. I thought you just wanted a companion. But tonight, I saw what he's capable of, and what you're capable of. You're a team, and I respect that." Claire smiled faintly. "Thanks, Mark. But it's not just about respect, it's about trust. Rocky's taught me to trust again, and tonight I trusted him with everything." Mark nodded, his face softening. "You're right. And for what it's worth, I'm glad he's on your side." With Boone and his men finally secured and the forest quiet once more, Claire prepared to leave. Rocky stood by her side, his body language calm but alert. Ever the protector, Ranger Stevens offered her a firm handshake. "Take care, Claire, and keep that dog close. He's worth more than you realize." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "He's worth everything." As she and Rocky walked back to her truck, the weight of the night began to lift. The stars above seemed brighter, the air clearer, as if the forest itself was exhaling in relief. As Claire drove home, her thoughts were a whirlwind of gratitude, fear, and determination. Boone's words haunted her, but she refused to let them define her next steps. If Rocky's past made him a target, then his future would be one of protection and strength. And if Boone or anyone else thought they could come for them, they'd be ready. The glow of the headlights carved through the darkness as Claire and Rocky approached the small cabin they called home. The silence that had once been comforting now felt heavy, every shadow in the trees casting a foreboding presence. Boone's words echoed in her mind, but she shook them off, focusing on the rhythmic sound of Rocky's breathing beside her. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, the faint scent of pine from her homemade candles mingling with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. She locked the door behind her, checking it twice before pulling the curtains shut. Rocky circled the living room, sniffing at corners and windows as if performing his own security check. Satisfied, he settled by the door, his ears alert. It was well past midnight when Rocky's growl pierced the stillness. Claire shot up from the couch, her heart pounding as she grabbed the flashlight and a heavy wrench she kept by the door. Rocky's growl deepened, his stance rigid, his eyes locked on the front window. "Who's out there?" Claire called, her voice trembling but firm. For a moment there was only silence. Then a faint rustling outside the window, followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. Claire's blood ran cold. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide their presence. Rocky barked sharply, a sound so commanding that it made her jump. He moved to the window, his body a coiled spring ready to pounce. Claire edged closer, peering through a gap in the curtains. The beam of a flashlight swept across the yard, revealing two figures in dark clothing moving toward the cabin. Claire's pulse quickened as she whispered to Rocky, "Stay." He obeyed, his body vibrating with tension. Gripping the wrench tightly, she moved to the back door, ensuring it was locked before returning to the living room. The first sound of the door handle rattling sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. "We know you're in there, lady," a gruff voice called. "Open up and we won't hurt you." Claire's hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "Leave now or you'll regret it." The response was a sinister laugh. "You've got guts, But we'll see how long that lasts. Rocky growled low and deep, his muscles taut as he waited for Claire's signal. She crouched beside him, her free hand gripping his collar. "Wait," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The door burst open with a loud crash, splintering the wood as the intruders forced their way inside. But they didn't make it far. Rocky launched himself at the first man, his powerful jaws clamping onto the intruder's arm. The man screamed, dropping the crowbar he'd been holding. The second man lunged at Claire, who swung the wrench with all her strength, striking his shoulder. He stumbled back with a grunt, but quickly recovered, grabbing her wrist. She twisted away, adrenaline sharpening her movements. Rocky, meanwhile, held firm, forcing the first man to the ground. His sharp barks and growls filled the cabin as he defended Claire with unwavering determination. The second man, realizing he was outmatched, backed toward the door. "Let's go," he shouted to his partner. "This isn't worth it." But the first man couldn't escape Rocky's grip. Blood dripped from his arm as he struggled, shouting in pain. Claire grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice steady despite the chaos. "2 intruders in my home. My address is 205 Maple Grove. Hurry!" The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as the intruders panicked. The second man bolted, leaving his partner behind. Rocky released his grip as Claire commanded, "Off!" And the injured man crumpled to the floor, clutching his arm. Moments later, the cabin was flooded with red and blue lights. Officers stormed in, quickly securing the scene. Rocky stood by Claire's side, his chest heaving but his demeanor calm, as if he knew the battle was won. As the police questioned Claire, one of the officers approached her with a grim expression. "We found their car down the road. It's registered to one of Boone's associates. Looks like they were sent here to finish what he started." Claire felt a wave of nausea. Boone's words had been more than a threat. They were a promise. But as she looked at Rocky, his steady gaze reassuring her, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice quiet. The officer hesitated. "We'll increase patrols in the area and keep you updated. But if Boone's network is as extensive as we think, you need to be vigilant." As the officers processed the scene, one of them knelt beside Rocky, scratching behind his ears. "This dog's a hero," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You're lucky to have him." Claire smiled, her eyes welling with tears. "I know. He's my partner," the officer nodded. "We'll make sure the report reflects that. If it weren't for him, this could have ended very differently." With the intruders arrested and the cabin finally quiet, Claire sat on the floor beside Rocky, wrapping her arms around him. "You saved me again," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Rocky licked her face, his tail wagging gently. Despite the fear and chaos, Claire felt a sense of peace. Boone's network might still pose a threat, but she knew she could face whatever came next with Rocky by her side. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the cabin, filtering through the trees and dappling the wooden walls with light. The once chaotic scene now felt calm, almost serene, as Claire sat on the front porch with Rocky by her side. His sharp ears perked at every sound, but his posture was relaxed, a silent sentinel watching over his domain. The events of the previous night lingered in her mind like a bad dream, yet there was a strange comfort in the aftermath. The police had assured her that the intruders were in custody and facing serious charges. Boone's network, they believed, had been weakened by their arrests, but they had also cautioned her to remain vigilant. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled Claire from her thoughts. She looked up to see her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, stepping out of her old sedan. The elderly woman approached with a basket of muffins and a determined expression. "I heard about what happened," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're brave, Claire. And that dog of yours, he's something else." Claire managed a small smile as she accepted the basket. "Thank you. Rocky's the real hero." Mrs. Henderson patted Rocky's head, her eyes misting. "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes, dear. If you ever need anything, you just call me. We neighbors need to stick together." The simple gesture of kindness brought tears to Claire's eyes. For so long, she had felt isolated, the weight of her past too heavy to share with others. But now, she realized she didn't have to carry it alone. Inside the cabin, Claire surveyed the damage from the break-in. The door had been repaired temporarily, and the few items that had been knocked over were back in place. Still, the sense of violation lingered. She took a deep breath, grounding herself. "We'll make this place even stronger, won't we, boy?" she said, glancing at Rocky. His wagging tail was the only response she needed. Determined to feel safe again, Claire contacted a local security company. By the afternoon, technicians were installing cameras and reinforcing the doors and windows. Watching them work, she felt a growing sense of control returning to her life. Later that day, Officer Ramirez stopped by to check on her. The sight of his familiar, reassuring smile was a welcome relief. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his tone gentle. "Better," Claire replied. "The security upgrades help, but I'm still processing everything." Ramirez nodded. "That's normal. It'll take time, but you're stronger than you think, and if you ever need backup, you know who to call." He crouched to pet Rocky, who immediately leaned into his touch. "This guy's incredible. We've been talking about him down at the station. Do you ever think about putting him back in action?" Claire tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" "Rocky's got instincts you can't teach. If you wanted, we could work with him, get him certified as a service dog or even a therapy dog. He's already a hero. Why not make it official?" The idea planted a seed in Claire's mind. She'd always known Rocky was special, but the thought of sharing his unique gifts with others was intriguing. As the sun set, Claire sat on the porch steps, Rocky's head resting on her lap. The tranquility of the moment felt hard-earned, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. She thought about how far she'd come since leaving her past behind. The struggles, the fears, the moments of doubt. They had all led to this point. And through it all, Rocky had been her constant, her protector, her friend. "Maybe Ramirez is right," she mused aloud, scratching behind Rocky's ears. "You've got a lot more to give, don't you?" Rocky's tail thumped against the wooden porch, as if in agreement. The next morning, Claire called the station to learn more about the service dog program. Officer Ramirez connected her with a local trainer who specialized in working with retired military dogs. The idea of giving Rocky a new purpose while continuing to strengthen their bond filled her with hope. Days turned into weeks as life slowly returned to normal. The cabin, now fortified with security measures, felt like a sanctuary again. Claire began training with Rocky, marveling at how quickly he adapted to new commands and tasks. The community rallied around her, offering support in ways she never expected. Neighbors stopped by with meals, shared stories of their own struggles, and reminded her that she wasn't alone. One crisp autumn morning, Claire and Rocky stood at the edge of a local park, watching a group of children playing. Rocky, now fully certified as a therapy dog, wore a vest that proudly displayed his status. Claire smiled as the children approached, their laughter filling the air as they reached out to pet him. "Is he a superhero dog?" one boy asked, his wide eyes filled with wonder. Claire chuckled. "You could say that. He's saved me more times than I can count," the boy grinned. "Can I be a superhero too?" "Of course," Claire replied, kneeling to his level. "Being brave and kind makes anyone a hero." As Rocky leaned into the boy's touch, Claire felt a profound sense of purpose. She had found a way to turn her pain into something meaningful, to use her story to inspire others. That night, as Claire sat by the fire with Rocky at her feet, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The danger, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it had tested her in ways she never imagined, but it had also shown her the strength she possessed and the power of the bond she shared with Rocky. "You're my hero, you know that," she whispered, leaning down to kiss his head. Rocky's tail wagged in response, his eyes shining with loyalty and love. As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled outside, Claire felt ready for whatever the future held. She and Rocky had faced the darkness together and come out stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the same way, side by side. Did you enjoy Claire and Rocky's story of resilience and heroism? If this tale inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think makes a true hero? And stay tuned for more incredible stories of courage, connection, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. See you in the next video.